Welcome to this edition of the Capital Brief. I'm Seth Berenzweig, back here in our BL Media studio in beautiful downtown Tysons, Virginia. Back in studio with our colleague and friend John Tamny. John, how you doing?
Good to be back.
Good. Football season is on. Pumpkin beer is back up. Feeling good about the fall?
I heard all that. I'm hearing the Redskins are looking bad as usual. So, or the Washington football team.
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, it's always we're always in a constant state of flux within that band of mediocrity. But who knows? Maybe things will change in about 40 years. But anyway, we're here today to talk about the latest, one of the latest articles that you wrote that I thought was really interesting for Real Clear Markets, and it's entitled "Venezuela: An Inconvenient Truth." And I'd like to talk about that because the topic. When you first hear the topic, you think this is going to be a narrow conversation. But the thing that I found really interesting about your article is that it illustrates how Venezuela is really kind of a common denominator to discussing and having really important observations about a lot of really broad major topics as it relates to American economics and politics. And the thesis, as I saw it, is that it really serves as a barometer for a reflection on a lot of different things. And it's probably easiest to just kind of dig into them one chunk at a time as opposed to just kind of throwing the whole thing at you. But let's talk about your observation. Well, just tell us generally a little bit about the article, and then talk about the conversation of what lesson you think it states with respect to money supply.
Well, Venezuela, presently 70% of transactions in Venezuela are refereed, are denominated in dollars. Dollar is the currency of choice in Venezuela.
For 70% of the economy.
Yeah. Venezuela is not dollarized. This wasn't planned by governments. Economic activity is rarely planned in the first place. There's production in Venezuela. The people are increasingly, it's still a desperately poor country based on the imposition of socialism, but they have reduced some of the price controls, a lot of the controls on economic activity. And so with this increased economic activity, the dollar increasingly is a factor in exchange among producers in Venezuela. So it's a very important story that where there's production, there will always be credible money to move that production around.
And the thing that's interesting is that the currency in Venezuela is the bolivar, which, as we discussed off the air, is also happens to be my favorite cigar. But that's another topic when we get to the cigar bar. But the value of the bolivar, of course, is relatively low. The strength of the U.S. dollar is relatively high. So even though Venezuela is a nation with which we have very fraught relations and really, frankly, no meaningful relationship, and they tend to try to apply a command economy. One of the areas of a thesis in your article is challenging the idea that an increased money supply will lead to increased economic growth and production. And you're challenging that thesis by saying perhaps it's the other way around. An increase in production will then lead to an increased flow of dollars, be it whatever the monetary supply is at the time. So explain that a little bit for us, and also explain, if you could, your theory with regard to GDP, because we talk all the time about GDP, but I found your conversation of that in the article really interesting.
Well, you just explained why so many of the assumptions about money are incorrect. Money doesn't instigate. Money's a consequence. Where there's production, money is always there to move that production around. And so you brought up the bolivar. It is their currency. It's a desperately devalued currency.
Right.
And so you would never exchange goods and services for bolivars. And you wouldn't, because the bolivars you'd accept wouldn't buy you much in return. So you'd give away something real, goods and services of tangible value, only to get bolivars that don't buy you commensurate goods and services of tangible value, of commensurate value. And so as a consequence, in any country, it could be Iran, it could be North Korea. What is the currency of choice there among producers? It is the dollar. Venezuela, the same way. Precisely because there's production, the producers want a trusted currency in return for their production because they know that the dollar will be accepted by all other producers in the country.
Well, the policy mavens here in Washington are going to have a little bit of heartburn about what you just said. And I don't disagree with what you just said, but a lot of the policy mavens would like to think that when you're talking about countries that are hostile to the United States, that sanctions and control from Washington can impose real consequences, and inevitably they do to some degree. There can't be any question about that. But what I find interesting about the point that you're highlighting from your article is that a lot of things that are happening in the United States have positive GDP consequences in these other countries that are hostile to us. Can you explain how that works? Because it's really it's illogical from an initial point of view, but explain to us how that makes sense.
No, it's very important. So Venezuela, as everyone probably knows, went, as you put it, command economy, went socialist in modern times. And when you go collectivist socialist, your economy naturally collapses. And so what that's meant is that Venezuela has lost 15% of its population. They've moved elsewhere.
They've left. They've left the country.
They've gotten out of the country because it's a country where you are no longer rewarded for productive work, or it certainly had been.
Right.
And so these people didn't stop working. They left Venezuela so that they could work more. And so Venezuela is now experiencing growing inflows of money, remittances from productive, call them Venezuela expats from around the world. And so this is another support source of consumption in Venezuela. Well, economists think consumption drives economic growth. No. Consumption is the consequence of economic growth. Production by Venezuelans outside of Venezuela is informing enormous amounts of consumption in Venezuela. In short, Venezuela's GDP, which I think is a worthless number, is in many ways a consequence of economic activity that doesn't take place in Venezuela.
Well, when you're talking about whether money supply chases economic growth and production, or whether production triggers money flow, which direction does it go into within a command economy, it really brings up questions and visions of what's going on in the United States Congress right now, one could argue, because the Congress is continually debating a lot of things pertaining to infrastructure and some elements of a command economy by trying to, increase chip production. And although I think there's certainly some good to be found in that, do the currents of this conversation cause any skepticism as it relates to Congress's approach or strategy that having these command economies and perhaps the Fed coming in and continuing to stimulate the money supply, is that necessarily going to result in increased economic growth in the United States?
No, by definition, it will not. And let's use an obvious. You and I
again,
both,
people are falling off their chairs in Washington.
No, that's right. You and I both live in Maryland.
Right.
So let's imagine for a second that the Fed wanted to stimulate economic activity in West Baltimore. It's a perpetually recessed, downtrodden part of a fairly major U.S. city.
Right.
So let's imagine the Fed buying up bonds from banks in Baltimore to increase money supply there. The money would disappear from Baltimore as quickly as it arrived. And why? Because money flows signal the flows of goods and services. Well, there's not a lot of production in Baltimore, and so the money would reach Baltimore banks but immediately exit Baltimore to more productive climes around Maryland and around the United States.
Right.
You can't force money into an economy where there's no production. Money, on the other hand, where there's a lot of production in an economy, money will be everywhere. And we know this. We can just look at, what do investment banks do? Why are they so prosperous? Because they are constantly searching and competing with other investment banks to finance economic activity. Money supply is the consequence of economic activity. It's not an instigator of it.
Well, and I think that the competitive interest rate environment supports your conclusion, because we do a lot of M&A practice at our law firm. And we're replacing a number of potential lenders on deals because we can find better rates. There are lenders that are really kind of climbing over each other saying, look, I'll come in, I'll get you a better rate. And we've saved clients a lot of money on that. I'm not raising that to try to have a conversation about our firm's transactional practice, but to the point that there is a lot of venture capital out there. There's a lot of money from a lot of different lenders looking to, and mezzanine participants that are looking to get in on the action because of exactly what you're saying, because they're looking for good deals with good companies. So it would seem that, and the argument would go, and I think it makes a lot of sense, but it's worth reflecting on. The politicians in Washington have the order backwards. In other words, if it's a command economy and we're going to promote these industries and we're going to continue to increase the money supply, and then that's going to stimulate economic growth. What you and I agree on is that it's really the inverse or the obverse. In other words, what we need to be doing is we need to be encouraging the private sector to create more private markets for better employment, for better and more competitive prices, for more advanced technology, and to have that economy help spur further economic growth that way. Because let's say, for example, you want to stimulate more economic activity in Baltimore, wouldn't it just be better to have more businesses open up downtown in Baltimore and create great goods and services? And conversely, if the Fed, I mean, everybody's talking about the Fed, and frankly, I think the Fed has become such a bloated octopus of so many tentacles with so many meetings and so many committees and so many districts that it's almost confusing. But if you had the chance to create some kind of meaningful, pragmatic reform when it comes to the Fed for the purpose of helping to truly stimulate the economy here, what kind of reform or what kind of ideas would you put up on the table?
Well, the reform would be realistically to stop trying to affect economic outcomes that you quite simply cannot make happen. Because as we know, and you know this very intimately by refereeing M&A deals, where there's production, there's always money. You never need to worry about money supply where there's a lot of productivity. And so we know Baltimore, the Fed couldn't increase money supply in Baltimore on its best day. I mean, let's imagine if the Fed helicoptered billions of dollars into the city center and people just scooped them up.
Right.
Assuming they spent it in Baltimore, no business is going to expand based on a helicopter drop. And so the restaurants, bars, clothing stores, you name it, would bank the money, and the money would flow out of Baltimore. It's kind of like when they build stadiums in cities and say this will grow the economy. Well, if there's not production there, the money's going to leave. But let's look at this in a bigger, you want to increase money supply in Baltimore? Well, let's imagine if Jeff Bezos one day says, I am going to relocate from Seattle to Baltimore. I'm going to sell off my assets. I'm going to start something new in Baltimore. Can you imagine the inflow of billions and tens of billions that would suddenly find its way into Baltimore, funding not just his ideas, but all the businesses clustering around Jeff Bezos?
Right.
Money supply is a consequence of productive, innovative individuals. It cannot be forced by central banks.
Well, and imagine all the secondary and tertiary effects. You would be talking about things that are going on in Northern Virginia right now. Not only are you talking about better salaries and better jobs for more people, but you're talking about a lift in the real estate market. You're talking about increased economic activity with other merchants in the area. One of the things that you just brought up to mind is a politician who seems to be one of the most popular new photographs that's going through social media right now. When you talk about talking about, for example, Amazon HQ2. You know that before they landed here in the Northern Virginia / Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, they were taking a look at Brooklyn. And there happens to be a politician in that area named AOC, who made the rounds with a somewhat famous jacket over the last couple of days in the Met Gala saying tax the rich, which was quite interesting because for $35,000 a ticket, I would imagine that most of the people that were there were rich. But anyway, I digress. The thing that's so interesting is that I remember, you talk about command economy. You talk about how to really be able to create jobs, and is government the answer, or is government getting the hell out the answer? It wasn't all on her, but she really helped drive out that initiative because she said that she wanted to, plant the flag in the sand, and that, no more corporate socialism, and that, everybody needed to get paid, and, Jeff Bezos is a bad guy. And she was not the only one, but she literally chased Amazon out of that neighborhood. And it was, do you think that helped her neighborhood? I don't think so. We love having Amazon here because, I talk to the real estate brokers and agents alone. They love Amazon because that's creating not only a lift in the real estate market for Northern Virginia, but even in the real estate market for the District of Columbia. There are houses in D.C., and there's so much of a renewal and so much promise for business and for real estate prices in the District of Columbia. So I know that we have to kind of bring this show in for a landing here, but Venezuela, talking about it being an inconvenient truth, what are the top lessons learned that you think Venezuela shows in terms of the fallacies that we're driving, that a lot of our politics and economic policy is guided by in America today?
Well, the first one that it will cause economists' heads to explode, because the Federal Reserve is the biggest employer of economists in the world, is that the Fed, and I've been arguing this for years, is just not terribly relevant. You never need to worry about money supply if you're productive. As an individual, city, state, country, as a street. Where there's production, money's always going to find you. The Fed won't plan it. Federal Reserve notes are around the world right now liquefying trade through none of the planning of central bankers here in the United States. So that's the first obvious. But the second one is to remind people that a focus on GDP ignores that any economic activity in any country is a consequence, A, of global cooperation, of people working together around the world, but frequently, given the massive productivity of individuals in the United States, so much of global GDP begins here, as in remittances from the United States fund all manner of this number we call GDP. So it's an inconvenient truth for much of the economics profession of just how superfluous the Fed is, their measures are, and realistically, I would add, how superfluous economists are.
So the people have the power. The government doesn't really have the power to formulate a growing economy to at least some degree. Yeah. And I think that one of the elements that came to mind when I was reading your article, which I really enjoyed reading, and it's something that we touched upon very briefly before, which will be my final point for today. The government needs to get out of the way. The government doesn't need to have one step in. They need to take two steps back. There's over $3 trillion worth of capital on the sidelines looking to go to work in corporate America today. Over $3 trillion worth of private equity. The cash is there. The interest rates are favorable. The economy overall is doing very well. And there are a lot of lenders and a lot of capital players, a lot of companies in the private equity space that are looking to really make things happen. It's a very exciting time in the M&A space right now from my perspective, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's neat that we have these conversations, because your perspective is from a place that I really can't speak from, because as a journalist and as someone who really studies and knows the economy, that perspective is refreshing. From a business attorney deal structure, perspective, I can tell you there's so many exciting things going on right now. And there's so much opportunity. There are companies that are getting investment from very sophisticated private equity players that are creating new technologies, that are creating new medicines to help extend our lives, to help to set up new areas of research in outer space. And it's really exciting. And frankly, the biggest potential destructive force is if the government steps in. So again, the private sector and private equity is best to lead the way. John, great seeing you again,
Yes.
and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Likewise.